Well, thank you very much for organizing this panel. I think the advantage of this panel is not only that we're from three different disciplines, I think we're using different methodologies, and focusing on different geographies will also help us to understand what developmentalism is. After visiting India and Philippines, now I will take you to Korea. My name is Yasin Kaya. I'm from political science. I will present you a section from a chapter that I write for my dissertation, which compares Korea and Turkey, and I focus on telecommunications sector. And today I will present you what happened in Korea telephony sector, service telephony, from early 1980s to 1997, when the big crisis happened. So I will try to bring a new methodology or a framework in which I will argue that the developmental state was a state form which was possible thanks to two factors. First, Korea's particular integration to global economy, and secondly, the distinct balance of forces within Korea that is conditioned by this integration into the global economy. And changes in the global capitalism and reconfiguration of class relations within Korea has brought an end or change to this state form. So for those who like numbers, I have some figures for you. I love numbers myself, so that I omitted the words, so you can enjoy the numbers here. So, but I'll explain you what these numbers are. 9% is the average annual growth in Korea in the 60s. So Korea grew 9% annually in average in 60s, 9.3% annually in the 70s, and 10% in the 1980s. That's a huge growth. And just to put these figures in perspective, Korea was in the 101 was the place of Korea in terms of the GDP per capita. So Korea, in terms of GDP per capita, was behind Haiti, Yemen, and Ethiopia in 1961. It was a poor country. And in 2009, it was 15th. So that's a fast growth in 4 decades. And this development was led by export. So this figure, 33.7, is the annual growth of export performance between 1962 and 1979. So every year, Korea's export grew that much. And among the exports, the share of its manufacturing output rose from 10% to 25% between 1960s and 1990s. So here we see a very fast growth based on manufacturing sector and exports. So in the 80s, people thought, how could Korea do this? And there were two answers to this question. The first one comes from neoclassicals. World Bank and IMF supported this view. And I don't want to go into the details of this, but this is a view that celebrates the performance of the markets. So they thought that the World Bank and the World Bank officials and the neoclassical economists, other neoclassical economists, absence of state intervention in the commodity and capital markets allowed Korea to grow. So unlike in Latin America, they said, the state did not control investment, market prices, or imports. Henceforth, there was no crony capitalism. There was no uncertainty for business, so business could grow. Unlike in Latin America, in their terms, where corruption happened due to state control. And the state, the Korean state, according to neoclassicals, was just like a night watchman. Just prepares the ground and just makes sure that the market forces, players are playing the game fairly. Actually, there was one problem with this approach. It did not reflect reality. And the new institutionalists, by the way, this view became the new consensus in the mainstream study of Korea, argued that the state in Korea had more active role, and they underscored several distinct features in Korea. Export targeting system. The Korean state was publishing export targets and making the businesses, capitalists, follow that target. And how were they able to do this? Well, the state had the control over the banking system. The banking system in the developmental Korea was nationalized, and it had control over the foreign loan allocation. So since the state had the money, it could rule. That was the perspective of the institutionalists. But there is some problems with this view. But before asking or raising these problems, let me go to the next slide. The institutionalists, within that framework, argued that, okay, we don't need that. All right, so since I'm a teaching assistant and I like marking, I use the same method here. So this is from an institutionalist who explains why the Korean developmental state collapsed. So according to them, with industrialization, the state's freedom of maneuver was lessened. So this means, the chaebol, big capital, became so powerful that with the industrialization, the state was weakened. Furthermore, international influence only reinforced those class pressures inside South Korea. The overall effect was to force a retreat of the state and an end to a developmental policy. I think there are three problems here, at least three. And I'll list these. First of all, if the industrialization was making the state weaker by making the big capital stronger, why did the state elites want industrialization? Why would the state elites, the ones who control the state, want industrialization that would eventually lead to their demise? And secondly, if developmentalism was so good, good for the big capital, why did they let it go? And I argue against this perspective. The rationality of the state, Korean state, and the big capital were different, but they coincided. They wanted industrialization, but for separate reasons. So we have to understand what the rationalities of these two forces are, what the rationality, motivation of the state was, what the rationality and the motivation of the capital was, and how they coincided, in which context. And secondly, the second problem is international influence only reinforced those class pressures inside South Korea. Two questions we should ask. First, how exactly does the outside forces influence the inside forces? That's a methodological question. What's the exact mechanism there? And secondly, well, are the internal agents in South Korea just receivers of the changes that are taking place beyond their control? How do they react to the opportunities and threats that take place in the global sphere? And the last problem is, according to the institutionalists, the state withdrew. There was a retreat of the state by the end of 70s and 80s. Well, I would use a different word here. I would call it a transformation. The state did not go anywhere, but it just changed its form. So we have to understand what the form of the state was during these developmental years and what it became with neoliberalism. So I'm trying to change the slide here. Let's change it here too. Okay, so very quickly, I mentioned you the neoclassical and institutionalist view, and I will tell you about the more critical views. According to Marxists and left social democrats, two things were missed in these institutionalist and neoclassical accounts. First, Korean state smashed labor. Disciplining labor, smashing labor and its organizations in Korea was the key for Korean developmentalism. And secondly, Korean state disciplined the capital. It made the big capital to act according to their plans. But two questions we should again ask. Labor was smashed, but I will let you know what implications of that but are. And secondly, how the state disciplined capital? I mean, why, if it was possible for the Korean state to discipline capital, why didn't the Turkish state discipline the Turkish capital? Why didn't the Indian state discipline the Indian capital? So question is the critical one here. Very quickly here, implications of this. But, well, the labor organizations in Korea were smashed, but the real wages in Korea increased almost by 200% from the mid-1960s to 1980s. So almost doubled from 1966 to 1980. And this is way more than the increase in Hong Kong, for example. The increase of real wages in Hong Kong was 150% in the same period. But what is, so if you just look at the real wages, this story is not relevant. It doesn't hold water. It doesn't reflect reality. So you shouldn't have an aggregate view. You should just focus on the manufacturing wages. Because manufacturing wages in Korea were lower than in other sectors. And wages in export-oriented sectors were lower than the sectors that were oriented towards domestic consumption. So if you just look at the labor and try to understand the role of the labor in developmentalism in Korea, you will be misled. You have to look at the specific sectors, export-oriented sectors and manufacturing. And as I said, disciplining capital, but how were they able to discipline the capital? So in the next slide, I will try to understand how this was possible. Remember, Korea was not the only country that tried to follow a economic developmentalism project. Turkish state was trying to do the same. Indian state was trying to do the same, but they failed. Korean state did not. The capitalist developmentalism was, in its own terms, was successful. So how was it successful? What was the context? So we have to see the general picture here. So as I said, it was an export-oriented economy. And as every export-oriented economy, you need what? You need a large export outlet. You need buyers. And the US market was a huge domestic market that could serve that role. But the problem was, you can't just go to United States and sell your products. The Korean capitalists needed networks in the United States, and they needed the technical know-how. They also needed the machinery. And after the normalization of relations with Japan provided those very important components. So Japanese conglomerates already had networks in the United States. Then they helped the Korean capitalists use those networks. They also provided know-how and technology to Korean counterparts. So this was a great opportunity for the Korean capitalists. As long as this mechanism, this relationship was in place, Korean chaebol big capital was making profits, and they were okay with the export targets imposed by the Korean state on them. So because they were making money, and what do capitalists want? To make money. They like this relationship as long as the Korean state protected this relationship. But with the, every good thing has an end. By the end of the 1970s, the profit rates in the United States decline. United States start pressuring Japan. With the Plaza Accord, the Japanese yen is appreciated. So Japan loses its export competitiveness. And in order to restore its profits, Japanese conglomerates, companies, big business become more harsh. And they're not that accommodating to Korean capitalists. So next. There are three factors for the decline of developmental state in Korea. I will focus on one of them, but I will mention the other two. So labor, the disciplined labor, smash labor was important for Korean developmental state's rise. But with the democratization, with industrialization, the base of the working class grew in Korea, and the wages and labor action in the 80s started to increase, and the wages had an upward trend. So they were pushing further, and the profit share of the big companies was in decline. The share of the wages was increasing. The profits of the Korean companies, in terms of share, were in decline. So there was a kind of a profit squeeze with the pressure coming from the labor. And secondly, remember, the Japanese accommodation is in decline, and the big capitalists in Korea have to have more aggressive strategy of competition. So they were investing and investing in order to cope with the Japanese, compete with the Japanese firms, as well as the new emerging capitalists from new emerging centers of accumulation in Southeast Asia. So they were investing to a certain extent that their investments were not be able to realize. My focus is reconfiguration of Korea's integration into the global capitalism. So the reconfiguration of that reconfiguration of this picture. My case. So I will try to explain you this reconfiguration by just looking at a case. And I will talk about the case of TDX project. TDX stands for Time Division Exchange. It's a digital switching system. So digital switching system is this. So in the old days, when I called Kenneth, I was, an operator in a room was just like taking the wire that was connected to my telephone and putting it in a hole that would connect to your telephone. So that was a manual switching. So these ladies are doing manual switching. And then came magnetic switching. And up until 1970s, the most popular, the most commonly used switching system was electromagnetic. But then, fully digital switching system was becoming the norm. In the 70s, the use of fully digital switching system surpassed the use of electromagnetic systems in the advanced countries. And in the 70s, the developing countries, including Korea, was trying to catch up. Okay. So it was a Korean state launched this TDX project, which was successful. It was successful because the state as well as Chaebol had distinct rationalities, yet these rationalities coincided within the favorable global economic conditions. So let's start with the favorable international conditions. So we're talking about a success story here. We're trying to understand the favorable global economic conditions, and we're trying to understand how the rationalities of the state and the big capital coincided. If we can understand, if we can put, if I can present this well, I think this will illustrate the mechanism of economic development in the 80s in Korea. So first of all, in advanced capitalist countries like the United States, the digital switches were introduced in the 50s. And until 1970s, there was a huge improvement. They were digitalizing, improving new innovations. In the 70s, this slowed down. And when the technological development slowed down, the dominant firms, they moved from a subsector to another sector. First, they were in low-density digital switching market, like household telephony, and they were moving to central office switches, more profitable. The customers were big businesses. So big firms from the United States were making that shift. Japanese firms were making that shift. They were moving from a less profitable sector to more profitable sector. And this benefited to the newcomers, including the Korean economic actors, because the household telephony system, there was a room for entrance, penetration to that market. So that was an opening in the global economy. And there was a latecomer advantage. The technology was already invented, so you don't need to reinvent it. You can just use it, transfer that technology to your domestic system, and build on it. So this also gave an opportunity for catch-up. And unlike the old big electromechanical switches, the new technology did not require high engineering skills. The maintenance of this new digital technology was easier, and it was customizable. You could customize it according to the needs of your customer. So what happened is the state wanted to have a universal telephony. They wanted one telephone in every household. So they launched this TDX project as a part of that effort. They invested heavily in this sector. I will give you some numbers if you're not tired. Telecommunications sector accounted only 6.5% in 1982, and this investment increased to 20% in 1986. So in 4 years, the rate of investment, government investment, increased from 6.5% to 19%. That's a huge change. And R&D the ratio of R&D to sales were like doubling in the same period. And the public research institutes were leading this effort. So the rationality was providing universal service. The action was research, investment coming from the state. What about the famous Chaebol in the 80s? Well, they were reluctant. They said, well, we're already making profits. And they were already in licensing agreements with the American and Japanese firms. They were like, they invested heavily in foreign technology with licensing. And they said, like, we want returns from our investments. We don't want our domestic system. So they were reluctant to join to this project. They didn't want the state to launch that project. They were fine with the mechanism that they had. So reminder, as a footnote, Chaebol is considered as a national bourgeoisie, right? They're defending the interest of the nation. Well, they were supporting the foreign technology, and they were against the national technological development. And they were not. They were also had a good deal. Well, they were buying this foreign technology, and they were reconfiguring it. And there was a constant buyer there, Korean Telecom, a public company. This company was buying the products of the big Korean corporations. Well, if you have a buyer, if you're a supplier, oh, that's a very profitable game. So they didn't want to engage in this TDX project first. But then, when the export opportunities arise, when the Korean state investment project was successful, they tried to utilize this opportunity. And but the point is, they entered the game after this project started to be successful. We can talk more about this in the Q&A session if you want. So in general, now I'm just focusing on the telecom equipment trade. So the export of Korean telecom equipment was way more than the import coming from foreign markets to Korea between 1984 and 1989. But this positive trade imbalance changed in the late 80s. And specifically, the trade imbalance with the United States was reversed. Korea started to import more telecom equipment from the United States and export stagnant or around the same. So why? Why did this happen? And very quickly again, remember this picture? This changed almost completely. Japan was pressured by the United States, especially in the semiconductor sector. Japanese firms were losing profits with the appreciation of the yen. Unluckily, the very companies that were active in the Japanese semiconductor sector, they were the ones who were in the telecom equipment sector. They were the same companies. So in order to offset their losses in semiconductor sector, they invested and heavily in the telecom equipment sector, and their competitive strategy became more and more aggressive. So here we started to see an increasing competition between the Japanese firms and the Korean ones in the telecommunication equipment sector. And not only that, in the United States, the telecommunications sector was being restructured. Instead of one big telephone provider, there were now multiple with the liberalization of the system. And if there are more actors, there is more competition. And with more competition, they were trying to utilize the export markets. So Korea and other developing countries, developing markets were a target. So this happy relationship was fading away with the end towards the end of 1980s. And the triggering factor there was the Plaza Accord, the United States pressuring Japan to appreciate yen and deteriorate, decline, which led to the decline of the competitive power of Japan. Okay, but American influence was not only indirect or structural, it imposed liberalization to a certain extent. In three stages. In 1989, first, the United States said, look, our trade imbalance is so negative with you Korean guys. We have to open your market. You have to open your market to US goods. So in three stages, Korean telecom market became more and more liberalized. First, the strategy was using bilateral agreements, then using the international agreements like GATT, and finally the WTO. Privatization. I want to spend some time here because you will see some parallels between the privatization of Korean telecom with the cases in Philippines. Yeah, I'm aware of time, so just 2 minutes. So there was an interaction between global economy and balance of class forces in the making of Korean telecommunications. So the first plan of privatization of the big service provider came well before the market was liberalized. And it was in the late 1980s, in July 1987, the details of the privatization plan was made public, but and the pressure was coming from United States to privatize the Korean telecom, so that a privatized Korean telecom could buy machinery from the American companies. But privatization was not possible because the domestic buyers didn't have a willingness to buy the Korean telecom. They didn't have the necessary capital to buy the Korean telecom. And Korean stock market crash, decline, stagnation between 1988 and 1990 also helped the suspension of this plan. The privatization was possible only after a huge class struggle. The labor was smashed in the telecom sector. After all, there were 60,000 workers in Korean telecom, and many of them had to be laid off, and that came with a huge labor struggle with the labor. And the big capitalists had to be convinced that the privatization of KT would be beneficial for them. But the state did not want one single big capitalist have control over KT, so they tried to have an equal share of stakes among the different chaebols. And neither of the big capitalists were willing to be a small player. They said either we will have full control of the KT or have majority sales, or we're not in it. And foreign capital was also a bit reluctant to step in because these relations were providing uncertainties. But chaebol could only be convinced to enter the game after the rate of the foreign capital, the stakes of the foreign capital were increased with after the 1997 crisis. Again, back to the footnote, the national capitalists came into the rescue of the, were interested in the sale of Katie only after the foreign capitalists stepped in. So much for a national capitalism. So let me conclude here. Perhaps some of these points can be expanded in the Q&A. The essence of the argument that I tried to make was that the developmental state in Korea was an interaction between these three forces: the state, labor, capital. The mechanism, the balance of class, the balance of forces between these three actors, the specific form of the specific form of the interaction between these three forces was a developmental state. But with the changes within global capitalism, this balance of forces changed. Hence, we are approaching, or after the 1997, we saw a transformation of the state form from developmental state to something different. Thank you.